Today, we're pleased to have with us Mikko Toivanen. Mikko is an assistant professor of history at the University of Warsaw. He specializes in global and colonial history with focus on the Dutch and British empires in 19th century Southeast Asia. Mikko received his BA from the University of Warwick, his MA from the University of Leiden, and his PhD from the European University Institute at Florence. Now, his doctoral research was about colonial tourism in Southeast Asia. But since defending his PhD, he has developed another area of research, right? And expertise on the history of urban cultures and public spaces in colonial contexts. Now, if you'd like to read some of Mikko's more recent work, right? He published 2 comparative histories of Batavia and Singapore last year. The first article appeared in Asian Ethnicity, and then the other article was part of a special issue of a journal called Early Popular Visual Culture. That's the name of the journal, right? And I'll just like to give a brief shout out to my colleague, Professor Justin Clark, who co-edited the special issue of this journal, which is called Seeing Time. Now, I've been a fan of Mikko's work since we met a few years ago, right? And his seminar today homes in on 2 important moments of colonial ceremony in Batavia, right? The city's 250th anniversary in 1869, and then the coronation of the Dutch Queen in 1898. Between these 2 events, this period, right, it charts the emergence of a new form of urban colonial public towards the end of the 19th century, one that appeared more inclusive, but was actually steadfastly hierarchical. His work speaks, at least in part, to a current field of scholarship on colonial Southeast Asia that is somewhat divided. Now, at the heart of this subfield, this scholarship, right, is one general question. What was the nature of interethnic relations and exchanges in the colonial cities of Southeast Asia? Were they characterized by segregation or interaction? By conflict or by coexistence? Now, on the one hand, you have a narrative that focuses on things like cosmopolitanism and conviviality, right? But on the other hand, you have narratives that are more critical of these social exchanges between different groups in different ethnic and social classes. Or perhaps it's now the time for us to get rid of these tired dichotomies. I'm just going to hand the time over to Mikko, who will tell us more about these questions and these issues and much more than that. So let's just please give him the warmest of welcomes.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that very generous introduction. I hope I'm sort of visible and audible to the people online. I don't know, but I presume that someone will tell us there's a problem. I think Michael did a great job of setting up the talk and already sort of giving me some ideas of what to talk about, actually, so that's very useful. So yeah, you can see the title of my talk there on slides, an invitation to the party. Maybe a bit of a cheesy title, but anyway. Well, what this is about creating a colonial public. We'll talk about the concept of a colonial public a bit today, and managing urban space in 19th century Batavia. Yeah, right. So usually when I give a talk in Europe, I always start with this slide, or a slide like this with Singapore on it, just to kind of make sure that everyone knows where we are, where Batavia is, and where Southeast Asia is. But this won't be a problem today, so I'm glad that I can sort of skip over that. But just to make clear that everyone knows, Batavia, Jakarta, now the capital of Indonesia, used to be the capital of the Dutch East Indies. And this is quite important that we're talking about a colonial capital here, because that means that the ceremonial order of the city is kind of a hotspot of ceremonial thinking in the Dutch Empire, right? And what I'll be talking about today comes from a larger project called Staging a Colonial Capital, my postdoctoral project, which has been focusing on Singapore and Batavia, broadly speaking, in the second half of the 19th century. Have been looking at things like the picture that you can see here of a procession, colonial procession, anniversaries, royal visits, all kinds of celebratory events like that. And now in the future, I'll be continuing on this research for a couple more years. I hope to sort of expand that research more into sort of everyday spaces of both sociability and ceremonial, so places like market squares or sort of school grounds, or some sort of more low-key locations. But today I'll be talking about these sort of big colonial ceremonies. And like Michael already mentioned, there are already 2 articles that I published from this project. You can see the titles there. Indeed, thanks to Justin again for taking me to be a part of that special issue that he edited. And then this other article in Asian ethnicity. So I'll be sort of building on the work in those articles today and hopefully kind of bringing in some new materials that I'm developing to be another article at the moment. Right. And before I get to my case studies, just to kind of frame this research a bit. So it is about the 19th century, but it is also about issues that are sort of topics of contemporary debate in the 21st century. So issues of how does empire use the cityscape, the public space of a city, how does it imprint itself on cities? And then how do post-colonial societies, both in the metropole and in the colonies, deal with those legacies and try to reframe those sometimes or reinterpret those legacies. So this has been, you've all heard about sort of statue wars in the UK and the US, so that's part of this debate. And also Singapore, of course, has been dealing with these questions, especially in the figure of Stamford Raffles and sort of what do you do with Stamford Raffles in the historical narrative. So there is this Singapore angle to this research as well. I'll be talking about Batavia today, but I'll be happy to sort of bring in a more comparative perspective with Singapore in Q&A. Right, so I'll be focusing on 2 case studies, like Michael said, from the middle of from 1860s and from the 1890s. And the first one is the 250th anniversary of Batavia in 1869. So to begin with, important to note that this is the 250th anniversary of Batavia, the Dutch city. So there was a city there before the Dutch arrived, and the Dutch sort of very deliberately tried to eliminate this earlier history. So this is very much a celebration of Dutch colonial presence on Java, Java. And this was quite a big thing. So this happened in May and June 1869 over sort of 4 or 5 days. On each of these days, we had several different things going on. There was quite a large sort of multifaceted program. And you can see there a scan of the official program booklet for the anniversary. And there was all these different things going on. So there was a laying foundation stone for a statue of Jan Pieter Schimpoen, the founder, the supposed founder of Batavia. There were concerts, both outdoors and sort of indoor concerts. There was a flower show, fireworks, a sports event, a whole separate sports event, and then the whole thing sort of ended with this grand ball and masquerade at the sort of the Colonial Club at the time. So all sorts of things going on. Why I find this program interesting from the perspective of the Colonial Public is that all of these different events are doing slightly different things. They're sort of designed to address slightly different audiences, create slightly different public sort of public modes of engagement, I would say, right? So there are different kinds of participation that are being called for in these events. On the one hand, you have events that call merely for passive audiences. So if there is a speech at a town square, then you just get people there to listen to the speech. They don't actually have to do it. They clap and maybe they sort of cheer, but they don't do much, right? A concert is obviously the same. So people come to listen to the music, they don't take part in the performance. And the fireworks, sort of visual events are the same, right? Now, in addition to these sorts of passive modes of engagement, there are also events that call for sort of direct active participation. And this participation can take different forms. So I mentioned the flower show, and this is a good example, I feel. This is quite a sort of a long-term process. For weeks beforehand, people were asked to send in flowers that they had grown at home. And then there was a jury that sort of looked at all the specimens and decided that this one gets a prize and that one gets a prize. So this was something that, you know, the authorities were sort of advertising in the newspapers for weeks ahead. Take part in this. You know, become an active member of colonial society, right? And what makes this particularly interesting is that this was directed specifically at women. So there's this gender aspect. This is a way of sort of constructing an active public role for women in colonial society, which had been sort of lacking from sort of public space before the mid-19th century, and a clearly defined role for women. And of course, this is very much middle-class women, Dutch women, all Dutch and mixed race women. So it's important to note that some of the people who got the prizes from the flower show were had Malay names, were Indonesian, sort of Dutch Indonesian. So this is also a way of sort of involving that large mixed race population in what is a sort of an officially acceptable form of colonial culture. So that's just one example. Similarly, the sports day that I mentioned was directed specifically at the indigenous population. So this happened on the central Royal Square of Batavia. There were sort of running races, climbing races, all sorts of sports things. But this was directed specifically at the non-European population, to the extent that this isn't even mentioned on the official program booklet. So this is kind of a separate event, right? And then finally, another demographic that was sort of being catered to separately, you have the really highest elites, the upper classes of the colonial authorities primarily, and the sort of rich merchants and so on, who then came to the Colonial Club at the end of the celebrations to have this big sort of, ball and dance and music and so on, a fancy dinner. And this is again a very distinct social group within Batavian society. So all these different demographics have their own things sort of designed for them to make a kind of a multi-layered system of Batavian public life. Another thing that I find quite interesting is to think about the geographical distribution of these events. So here's a map of Batavia, and you won't be able to see a lot of detail, but just the important thing to note is that you get these kind of two red splotches up top in the north and in the south, and those are the old town and the new town of Batavia. So old town is up top near the port, and the new town is sort of in the sort of more highland inland area. And the new town area is where all the rich Europeans lived. So this is also where most of these events happen, actually all of them. So this is a map zoomed in on the Royal Square in the new town, and the red marks that I've put in are the places where every specific event happens. So you can see that everything in this anniversary celebration is going on in a fairly small area around the Royal Square. So this is just sort of the lower quarter of the map that you can see here, right? So geographically, we're in a very condensed space. If you have been to Jakarta, even today, central Jakarta, you will sort of be familiar with this style of 19th century neoclassical Dutch architecture and sort of whitewashed Italian-style porticos and so on. So these are the kinds of places, venues where these events happened. And the venues are also important because they are a way of shaping public participation in events, right? So there are different venues that have different levels of access to people. So there are free events, a thing that happens on the Royal Square, which is a free space. Anyone can come there, or basically that's the best example of that. The unveiling of the statue on the Waterloo Square, also kind of near the Royal Square. So these are things that everyone can come to, right? Then you have events that have ticketed access. So you have to buy a ticket. Usually, you might get it for various reasons, but usually you have to buy a ticket. So there's no list of who can participate, but you have to have some amount of just free cash to be able to attend. So the concert would be a good example of this. This happens at the Schouwburg there on the left, so the theater building. So there's someone controlling tickets on the gate, and then you get it. And then finally, you have the most exclusive events which require an invitation, personal invitation. So the ball is an example of this. All the sort of important Dutch individuals were sent letters saying, show this letter at the gate, you'll be allowed into the ball. So you have this, again, this sort of multi-layered system of access to different levels of public spaces and different levels of access to different people. And the important thing to note here is that with all of these venues, the cultural sort of representation, the cultural content of the spaces is exclusively European coded. So we are in a very much sort of a Dutch environment transported into the tropics. Now, when I say Dutch coded or European coded, that doesn't mean that non-European individuals, Asian individuals, Japanese individuals didn't have any role in the celebrations. So for example, here we have the Garden Saleh, the very famous painter, and his villa, which is near the Royal Square. And the grounds of the villa were used for the fireworks display, for example. So there were ways for, especially Javanese nobility, primarily to sort of take part in the organization of these events, but that sort of diversity of organization did not show in the public facing aspect of these activities. So bearing all of that in mind, I'll just move into my second case, which is from the 1890s, and I'll show some similarities, some differences, and then at the end, I'll try to draw some conclusions on what we can learn from these two case studies. So the coronation of Queen Wilhelmina, actually coronation I think is the wrong word. Technically she was coronated in 1890 when her father died, but in 1898 she becomes 18, so she ascends to the throne, right? She becomes the legitimate ruler of the Dutch kingdom and empire. And this was a similar sort of festival in many ways. It took sort of 5 days, I think 5-6 days, and had a similar sort of multifaceted program with very similar component events. So there were sort of statue unveilings, military music, fireworks, an opera performance, and again, these sort of sports events and grand walks. So a very similar sort of overall complex of ceremonial. Although there are some differences, and one very interesting difference is there were also these separate events for children. So like a kinderfest, a kind of a party, there was music and there were performers, there were sort of apparently some sort of German sailors whose job was to play with these kids. So there's this participation by children, which is new. And it's quite interesting, we're going to talk about that. I think one part of why children are suddenly included in the celebrations is because the Queen has this symbolic role as the mother of them. So then the children are in some sense her children, and they become a part of the event. It's also part of this sort of long-term process of making the public face of Dutch Empire more family friendly, giving a place for women and children, and sort of this idea that it's okay for Europeans to go to the tropics, it's morally fine because there are all of these family friendly things going on. However, the most interesting difference between these two cases is the sort of thing that you can see here in this picture. So this is a kind of a Chinese gate, celebratory Chinese Star gate. You can see a Dutch flag there in the corner as well. So suddenly the visual representation of these ceremonies is much more diverse in its, it sort of embraces the ethnic diversity of Batavia as a city. And the Chinese in particular are kind of mentioned everywhere as the prime example of this, so how enthusiastic they were in taking part in these celebrations. This photo is also by a Chinese photographer that I haven't really been able to find out more about yet, but kind of just shows the more general participation by the Chinese community. So there's increased representation. There is, for example, what's called a Great Chinese and Malay procession. I'm not entirely sure yet to what extent there was a separate Chinese and separate Malay procession, to what extent this was one event. I'm sort of looking into that at the moment. But anyway, this is kind of described in quite a lot of detail in the newspapers. It's interesting. So the European newspaper writers mention sort of ear-splitting noise of the procession. And of course, that's a kind of a racist caricature, but it also points out to the fact that the diversity is not just visual, it's also sonic. And I think this is quite important. There's Jenny McCallum has done good work on soundscape in 19th century Singapore and shows how colonial sort of European authorities in colonial cities become increasingly open to allowing non-European music in public spaces over the course of the 19th century. So this also happens in Batavia. Procession is a good example of it. There's also a lot of sort of visual stuff going on. There's sort of torchlight processions, and paper dragons that people are carrying around. So this was really quite a big show. There was also separately a festival with sort of gamelan music and wayang performances. All these sorts of non-European entertainments, local entertainments, which was also there was free entrance for the children of the Asian communities, the different Asian communities. So in Landers framed of Oosterlingen is how the Dutch authorities usually, the terms that the Dutch authorities usually use when they want to sort of define everyone who is not European. So this means inlanders, kind of natives, so the peoples that are considered to be native to the Dutch East Indies, and Vereenigingen, foreign Easterners. So this includes the Chinese community, but also Indians and Arabs and so on. So basically, this is the Dutch way of saying everyone who isn't us. You can see this increased representation also on the organizational side. So I'm not entirely sure if you can read the photo there, but this is just a page with some of the organizing subcommittees of festivities, and there you can see again Javanese nobility, but also all the sort of community heads, the Chinese, the Arab sort of leaders of those communities in Batavia, and they all take part in the organization of at least some of these events. So there's much more diversity in the people who are organizing these things. The major of the Chinese community, so the leader of the Chinese community, Tio Tako, was especially mentioned in a lot of newspaper reports as a kind of a driving force of this celebration, of this sort of ceremonies. So he was really throwing his weight behind the fact that the Chinese community had to be visible. That's quite interesting. There were also a lot of Islamic elements in these celebrations. So there was a public prayer for the Muslim community at the sort of major masjid or mosque in Dakojang, but also smaller events at all the mosques throughout the city. So this is quite a major difference to the earlier celebrations, where there's basically no sort of acknowledgement of the Muslim community at all. There was also this sort of special prayer, Muslim prayer, Islamic prayer commission for the event that was read out at all of these events and also published in the newspapers. And then also a telegraph from the Arab community specifically, sort of a kind of congratulatory telegram for the Queen. So all this kind of this visible participation of all these different communities. And it's a sort of charitable meal also in the old town for the Muslims. So in terms of the colonial public, what do these sort of differences mean? So as I already kind of pointed out, on a very simple level, there's just kind of much wider geographical range. These celebrations penetrate the city in a much more extensive way. So here again, you have the map of kind of the whole Batavia, old and new, and I've just circled a few of the locations that were used in the coronation ceremonies but were not used in the 1860s, and they're kind of generally around the Old Town area. So there's a Chinese quarter in red, there's the Bongkakojans, which is like an Arab neighborhood in yellow, and then also just a general Old Town area in blue. So there's stuff happening here, but also important to note there's stuff happening throughout the city. There's decorations put up on not every street, but sort of streets and villages and homes everywhere around the city. The coronation ceremonies are just visible to everyone on a much deeper level than the anniversary celebrations, which were really focused on the Old Town area. But in addition to this sort of geographical reach, there's also a much wider variety of spaces employed. And that includes spaces like this, the mosque in Kampung Bakojan, things that become sort of incorporated into the colonial ceremonial order, if you will, in contrast to the 1860s, when you only had these sort of whitewashed neoclassical style European buildings. So this is also interesting in terms of what it tells us about what is the colonial public, what is an acceptable form for the colonial public to take in the eyes of the colonial authorities. Now, unsurprisingly, you have all this increased representation and diversity, but this comes with very strict conditions and limits, right? And most strikingly, it's not surprising that there's segregated participation in all these events. So there's separately this procession for the Chinese and Malay communities and separately a European procession, right? What was kind of most striking for me is that there are these separate parties for the kids. So there's one for the European kids, and then the next day there's one for the Indonesian Chinese kids. And then also in terms of Christians, there are of course also indigenous Christians in Batavia. They also had their separate prayer events. So there's this really quite strict demarcation of the lines of participation. So you're allowed to participate, but you're not allowed to participate side by side with the Europeans. There's also segregated audiences. So things like there was a boat race in the harbor And people sort of came there either on coaches or on the tram. And then there were policemen at the tram stop sort of showing where you need to go, depending on if you're European or Asian. So this is it's kind of very physical and concrete division. So those are the two case studies, right? I've been quite quick to sort of leave time for the discussion afterwards, but you get an idea of the two cases and what the main differences are. Now I have just a few slides on conclusions and in terms of explaining or maybe justifying the kind of the logic of my project and sort of the general thrust of my research project in more general terms. Why does it matter? Why is it important? Why is it worth studying? And I have these three arguments, which I think both of these events show in different ways. So colonial urban culture, and by this I mean specifically the culture as sort of determined by the colonial authorities in a top-down way. It fixes and specializes roles in the urban hierarchy for specific communities. And I think you can see the specialization in these events. So where these events happen is really important because it kind of establishes rules for where specific people are allowed to be seen. In addition, colonial urban culture establishes norms for social behavior and rules of participation. So this is precisely what these sort of multi-layered programs of events do. So they create different kinds of settings for different communities within the city to participate in colonial culture. So depending on how much money you have, depending on your racial background, there are different things available for you that you can do, how you can sort of participate in these things. And it also determines conditions for social mobility. So if you have status or wealth that you can sort of participate in actually organizing these things, that secures you some amount of upward mobility in colonial society. And finally, and this is especially the case for the anniversary, but you can also see this in the coronation. It's a representation of what is an idealized version of colonial history. So by basically eliminating the memory of sort of the pre-Batavian, pre-Dutch history of the city, you create this sort of, you create this colonial narrative of history where Batavia begins when the Dutch arrive, and therefore what the Dutch decide decides what everyone does in the city. Now, in terms of the change over time, so there are these changes that happen, changing colonial conflicts. And I've kind of already hinted at this sort of threefold expansion of the idea of the colonial public. So there's more of the geography of the city becomes involved, and new and different kinds of spaces and buildings become employed, and there's a wider representation for the different segments of the population. So I think that's quite clear from the two cases. More interesting is to think why these changes happen. And I haven't like fully locked down my interpretations of this specific question, but some possible reasons that I've thought about. One is just simply infrastructural. So a lot of things happen in the second half of the 19th century. You get tram lines, you get things like telegraph lines, so water infrastructure that in a way makes the city smaller. It makes it easier to move from one part of the city to the other. It also makes it easier for, say, wealthy Chinese individuals to reach a certain sort of status of being accepted by the Europeans if you get your sort of artesian well, clean water, and so on. So these sort of technological advances make it easier and arguably also make it necessary to include a larger scope of the city in these public events. Now, secondly, and of course this is a much longer term process, but there is a sort of economic entrenchment of various communities, but especially the Chinese, who become sort of economically extremely important in the life of Batavia. So they just need to have that role in celebrations because of the power that they have in the city. And of course, similar things happen in Singapore, as you know. And then one that I'm not so sure about, but I think it's interesting to think about, is the difference of these events, just the nature of these events. One is a royal celebration, and the other one is arguably what you might call a colonial celebration, but also a specifically urban Batavian celebration. And these have slightly different connotations. Like I already mentioned, and sort of Queen Wilhelmina was considered to be a kind of a mother of the empire. So that is a different sort of figure than Jan Peter Schoen, who's the founder of Batavia, who's very much this sort of strict military administrative leader with a very sort of bloody and violent legacy as well. Whereas Wilhelmina is this sort of fluffy, everyone loves her sort of, that's the idea that you want to convey in celebrations. And there's also this different relationship between a queen and her subjects, which is a more personal sort of relationship than the relationship between an urban administration or a colonial administration and its subjects. So there are this different flavor to these festivities, I think, because of that. But like I said, despite this increasing participation, the rules and boundaries of engagement were tightly controlled by the authorities. And this is my last slide, and I think I'm doing quite well for time. Because these are all sort of top-down celebrations, right? This is what the authorities are telling people to do. But it's also, of course, interesting in a colonial setting to think about what can people do from the grassroots to contest this colonial vision, or to offer alternatives. And I think what's been interesting for me to think about is that there are actually two different modes of contestation or genres of contestation. And one is the obvious one, sort of the active resistance, which can be violent or can be sort of protesting. And there was a bit of this, especially in the 1860s. So there were threats of violence going on around the city. There was an idea that some sort of rebellion uprising might happen to disturb the celebrations, or there was even a worry that they might have to cancel the celebrations completely. Now, this didn't happen in the end, but just the fact that the rumors were going around is I think, quite an important example of how the people, the various communities, the people who were not in power, were also aware that these ceremonial moments can be used as a weak spot in the colonial order. If you hit there, then it hurts the authorities more than if you do it on another day, on a normal day, right? So there's a bit of that. But also it's important to think about passive forms of resistance or contestation. And these are, of course, extremely difficult to sort of pass from the historical sources, from the records. But there are some hints here and there. So, for example, in the Straits Times, on the 1869 anniversary, you have this just kind of a stray quote in a longer piece about the anniversary, saying the natives showed little interest in laying a foundation stone for the statue of Jan Peter Schoen. And this is, of course, something that the Batavian newspapers don't talk about because they want to give an image of the celebrations being wildly successful and everyone really loving it. But the Singapore papers are quite happy to sort of show that actually, no, not everyone was loving it. There were sort of people who had different ideas. So the quote as such doesn't tell you much, but it does kind of point at something that can easily be forgotten if you only read the colonial archive, which is that people can just not be interested and just not show up. And that is also a form of resistance, especially in a kind of celebration that is designed to show the empire in its best light. The more participation you have, the stronger the authority behind the celebration. There are similarly in the 1898 ceremonies, there are some kind of vague comments in the Dutch press about certain communities within the city not sort of really pulling their weight. They're sort of maybe like putting a flag up, but not really doing anything else. So they're just sort of doing it for show, but not really feeling it. And this is kind of a similar sort of question of, you know, how much do you actually have to participate to be doing your part? So that's just to maybe sort of provoke some thoughts and questions. This idea of passive or passivity or non-participation as a possible mode of resistance. But I'll leave it there. I hope you've got some interesting material to talk about, and yeah,